welcome back. You know, the Bible is a wonderful book. It's full of the most extraordinary stories of ordinary people, men, women, boys and girls, who did great things for God. They expected great things from God, and they attempted great things for God. There were people who faced dangers from wild beasts, dangers from people who wanted to kill them, opposition, hatred. They went without food and clothing sometimes just to follow God and to live to please Him. Why do you suppose they did all those things? Why did they face such great dangers? It was because they loved God with their whole heart. They realized that God had done so much for them. And throughout history, people have done the same thing. They've given their lives to follow God because Jesus was all the world to them. Jesus had given His life for them, and now they wanted to serve Him. The story of Elijah is just such a person who gave his life, gave up everything, gave up his family, his home and his friends, so that he could serve God, give his whole life to Him. It was Elijah who climbed the mountain to face the whole world and challenge the whole world to turn away from their sin and follow God. Let me tell you more about that story and how you too can be such a follower of God who would do great things for Him. Well, it's time to begin, so let's sing a song I think you all know. Our God is a great big God, and He holds us in His hands, and then we'll have our story of Elijah today.
Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God, and He holds us in His hands. Summer
an extraordinary day. It was a day like no other day ever before. It was something that had never even entered into Elijah's head. Now, Elijah had had some surprising, amazing, extraordinary days before, but this day was something that, well, it doesn't happen every day. Come on, let me tell you. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll tell you in a minute what it was, but it was the most surprising, it was the worst of days for Elijah, and yet it was the most exciting and amazing day. And when I tell you what happened, it will just take your breath away. You'll just gasp in surprise at how amazing this day was. It was something that had never happened to Elijah before in all the amazing days that he'd had. This was the amazingest amazing day that he had ever had in his entire life. I'll tell you what, I'll remind you of some of the extraordinary days Elijah had had, and you can give a mark out of 10 as to which one you think was the most extraordinary, and yet none of those days will have a patch upon this most extraordinary, worstest day of Elijah's life. Well, for instance, give a mark for this. The day when God first called Elijah. Elijah was in his home in Gilead, and God spoke to him. Elijah was praying, and he knew that he was in the very presence of God. He was standing before the King of Kings. And God spoke to Elijah's heart and said, Elijah, I've got a job for you to do. I want you to go and stand against all the evil that is in the world. I want you to go and tell people to turn away from their sins. I want you to leave your home, leave your family, and go back to the land of Israel, where there's an important job for you to do. Well, that was an extraordinary day. Can you remember the day when God first spoke to you, for instance? That was a special, exceptional day. And in Elijah's heart, he knew how hard it was going to be. And following Jesus sometimes can be very hard. He knew how hard it was, how difficult it would be to leave his family and home and friends and go out all on his own to face that danger. And yet, for his love for God, and because what God had already done for him, Elijah left everything to follow after what God had told him to do. How many out of 10 would you give that? What, 5, 6, 7? It was really extraordinary day for Elijah. And what about the day? How many would you give out of 10 for this one? That day when Elijah went right into King Ahab's palace. It was an amazing experience to go right into the palace. Nobody had invited him, but he stood there in front of King Ahab. And Ahab must have had a really angry look on his face when Elijah said, Ahab, because of your sin and because all the people have turned away from God, there will be no more rain in this entire land, not even the early morning dew. There'll be nothing in this land until I say so. That must have been really difficult for Elijah. I think he was quite glad when he turned round and got out of the court safe and sound. Now, that was an extraordinary day. How many out of 10 would you give Elijah for that one? 5, 6, 7? It's getting a bit more difficult, I think. What about this? The day when Elijah went to the brook, God told him to go and hide from King Ahab, and God would take care of him by the brook of Cherith. And for night after night, month after month, Elijah had slept on the cold floor of a cave. That was an exceptional experience for Elijah. Really difficult every night. Wondering exactly what Ahab was doing and if Ahab might just find him hiding there in the valley. How many out of 10? Come on, give me a score. How many out of 10? Well, how many out of 10 would you give for this? How extraordinary is this, that every day God had sent to Elijah birds, ravens, to give him food, and they'd come every morning and every night with their bread and with the meat. And Elijah sat by the brook, and he had more than most people in the entire country. That was an extraordinary experience. And here's another one. The day when God said to Elijah, now Elijah, there's no more water coming down this brook. The drought has gone on for so long. There's not much water left in the land. I want you to leave this brook now and go to the city of Zarephath, where there's a widow I've got ready to feed you. She'll take care of you. And Elijah had gone off, and he found that poor widow woman who only had 2 sticks and hardly any food left in the house. She was going to have her last meal. And Elijah had the cheek to say to her, give me some of your bread before you eat any. That was an extraordinary day. But that still has nothing to compare with this special day I'm going to tell you about today. When I tell you about this, you will just gasp in amazement at what was going to happen, something that had never ever happened to Elijah before. In fact, it had never happened to anybody else before. You see, after Elijah had met the widow woman, he went to live in her house and she took care of him. She actually gave him the best room in her house, the room upstairs. And Elijah went up to that room, and at last he had a nice comfortable bed to sleep in. I think he quite enjoyed living with the widow, and he got to know, because the widow had a little son, do you remember? And Elijah, I can imagine, the Bible doesn't tell us this, but imagine a lot over the months that living with the widow and her little son, Elijah got to know them really, really well. And do you remember what they had to eat? God had provided for them every day in a miraculous way. Every morning, the widow woman went to her jug to get some flour. There was some flour in it, and she'd use it all up with the oil to make some bread. And the miracle was, although she used every bit of flour that was in the jug, when she came back the next day, there was more in it. God was taking care of her. And I think that widow woman had learned over the weeks and the months how great God was, how faithful God was in this wonderful miracle he was performing for her. If it wasn't for God, both she and her son would have died of starvation, but God was providing for her. I think it must have really, over a period of time, made that widow woman think, God is really good to me. Elijah's God is a great God taking care of us. And maybe there was just a little bit of love beginning to build up and grow in that widow's heart, just thinking about, day by day, God providing for her, the grace of God. And in the morning when they sat down to have their breakfast, do you know, sometimes before you have your meal, your mum might say to you, let's say grace. Let's give thanks to God. Well, this widow woman just knew the grace, the goodness, the mercy of God for her every day she came to make the food. Again, I'm only making this little bit up, but I imagine when Elijah was living in the house, just imagine him, he's upstairs in his bed, and it's morning time, and the little boy calls to Elijah, Elijah, come on down, it's time for breakfast. And you know, sometimes you don't want to get out of your bed, do you? You just lie there and your mum calls you for your breakfast, and you say, oh, right, mum, what are we having for breakfast today? Well, Elijah was in bed, and I can imagine the little boy shouting up that says, Elijah, come on down to get your breakfast. And Elijah would say, what are we having this morning? Oh, this morning, Elijah, we're having some bread and some water. And they laughed because that's all they had. But you know, that was more than most people had. Most people had hardly any food at all. And at night time, when it came for tea, the little boy would call to Elijah, Elijah, come on down, it's tea time. What are we having for tea? Elijah might shout. Oh, today we're having some bread and water. And so it was. Every single day the little boy would say to Elijah, come on down, let's have some bread and water. But God was taking care of them. But then, this day I was talking to you about, this extraordinary day when something happened that had never happened to Elijah before, that day came. That day, there was no voice to call Elijah for breakfast. Nobody called up to Elijah and said, Elijah, come and get your breakfast. There was no sound. You see, that little boy had taken ill. And that morning, instead of Elijah hearing the voice of the little boy calling, he heard the most terrible wailing and perhaps even screaming and crying coming from downstairs. It wasn't the little boy. It was the widow woman. Elijah couldn't get down the stairs fast enough. He got down the stairs as quickly as he could, and when he came into the room, there was the widow woman sat on the chair with her little boy in her arms, and the little boy wasn't moving. There was not the slightest movement from the boy's body. Elijah's heart sank for a moment when he realized what had happened. The little boy had died. That was the worst day in Elijah's life, because I can't imagine anything worse happening than the lady's little boy dying. Do you know, if your son was to die, how dreadful that would be? I think she'd be sitting there and she'd be so numb, so much in shock, that she wouldn't know what to think or what to say. And inside, it seems, there was a lot of anger growing in her heart, because as soon as Elijah came into the room, she began to blame Elijah for the boy's death. She said, "Oh, that's why God sent you. God sent you to remind me of how bad I am, of all my sin, and God's punishing me for my sin, isn't he, Elijah? And that's what you've come here for. You're the servant of God, and you've just come to tell me about my sin." Some people think like that, you know. They think that God just wants to punish them all the time. And sometimes when things like that happen, as bad as that, people begin to say, why did God let that happen? Why has this happened to me? And the woman had forgotten all the good days when God had been so kind to them. She forgot about all the kindness God had shown, because all she could think of was her little boy was dead. Her world had come to an end. She'd lost everything. She didn't have much to start with, but she had a son, and now the son had been taken from her. She'd lost everything. This was the worst of all days. Elijah, I guess at first, wouldn't know what to say, wouldn't know what to do. But for some reason he went over to the woman and he took the little boy out of her arms and lifted him into his own arms. I think she must have been just in so much shock by this time. She didn't know what to say or do. She must have just been sitting there crying and wailing and really being so upset. I think by this time the neighbours must have heard what was going on, and I guess they would come running in to say what had happened. But Elijah took the little boy in his arms and went up the stairs with the little boy. What he expected to happen, I do not know. But he took the boy upstairs and put the boy on his bed. He knew that if anyone could help, it was God. And in fact, God was the only one who could help. The boy was dead. What? Nobody had been brought back to life before. So what did Elijah expect to happen? Elijah got down before God and he said, "God, you are a God of mercy and goodness. Please, God, I ask you to come and restore this boy's life. Breathe back into his body the breath of life." Elijah stood up. Nothing had happened. The boy still lay there, not moving. For a second time, though, Elijah wasn't going to give up that easily. He knew how great God was, and he was determined that he was going to do everything he could to get God to heal the boy. So he stretched himself over the boy again and prayed, "God, please heal this little boy. I know you're a merciful God. I know you're a great God, that you can do anything. Please heal this little boy." Elijah stood up again the second time. Still not a movement. The third time, Elijah got down and stretched over the boy and said, "Oh God, I love you with all my heart. I ask you to heal this boy, not because of me, not because I'm good, not because even I'm your servant, but because you are a great and a merciful God, full of loving kindness, full of mercy. Please breathe life back into this boy. And Elijah stood up. What a moment it was. What an extraordinary day. What an unusual, exceptional day. Because as Elijah looked at the little boy began to move. His eyes opened. And he moved his hands, he moved his arms. He sat up on the bed. Didn't I tell you, you gasp, when I told you this extraordinary thing that had never ever happened before? Elijah himself was, well, he knew God could do it, but he'd never seen it happen before. God had brought the boy back to life. The two couldn't get downstairs quick enough again to show the mother that the little son was alive. Well, can you imagine how the mother suddenly felt from feeling so desperate and so upset one moment? All of a sudden she was full of happiness and joy and excitement and wonder at the power of this majestic God of Elijah's. And she said to Elijah, Elijah, now I know that your God is the only true God, that the Lord, He is God. Well, that's all God wants people to know. That's all He wanted the widow to know, was that He was the only God, that she should love and serve Him. Soon the whole of Israel would know that the Lord, He is God. Soon the whole of Israel would realize that Baal wasn't a God, that the Lord alone, He is God. That was such an exceptional day. But it wouldn't be the last exceptional day in Elijah's life. I told you about some before, and next time I'll tell you about another extraordinary day. Because God spoke to Elijah very soon after he healed that boy. God spoke to Elijah and said, Elijah, I'm going to bring the famine to an end. I'm going to send rain. So I want you to go back to see King Ahab. That would lead to another extraordinary day. Join me next time. But don't forget to click like and subscribe, and come back and join me next time. Let's sing a song just before we go.
To